What about the will? I asked. I heard there's a clause that benefits me. His smile faltered for a moment. Yes, well, he said, your grandfather was sentimental. He didn't always think things through. Oh, I said, feigning disappointment. I see. Don't worry, he repeated. We'll handle everything. You just focus on grieving. I nodded, my eyes downcast. Okay, I said softly. Thank you, Uncle Richard. He patted my shoulder. Anytime, Ava. We're family. The first thing I registered was the scent, a cloying mix of lavender and dust that always clung to this room. My room. My old room. I blinked, trying to clear the fog from my brain. Where was I? The floral wallpaper, the frilly curtains, the ridiculous canopy bed, it all looked so familiar. Too familiar. I pushed myself up, my head swimming. My reflection in the dresser mirror confirmed my worst fears. Younger, much younger. The lines around my eyes, the weariness etched into my face, all gone. Instead, a face stared back at me, a face I hadn't seen in years, a face that still held a flicker of innocence, a flicker that had been extinguished long ago. My gaze drifted to the nightstand. A digital clock blinked 2:17 a.m., and the date. October 27th, 2010. My breath hitched. 3 years. 3 years before everything. Before Grandpa died. Before they took everything. Before I died. Disbelief warred with a strange, chilling sense of inevitability. Was this some kind of cruel joke? A hallucination? But the scent of lavender and dust, the feel of the cotton sheets, the weight of the old comforter, it all felt so real, too real to be a dream. A wave of memories crashed over me. Grandpa's warm smile, the way he used to tell me stories, the feel of his hand in mine. And then, the shadows, the greedy eyes of my relatives, the hushed whispers, the forged documents, the cold, calculating betrayal. They'd taken everything, left me with nothing. And I died alone, abandoned, while they lived in stolen luxury. But not this time. This time, things would be different. A slow smile spread across my face. They thought they'd won. They thought they'd gotten away with it. They were wrong. So very wrong. I glanced at the younger version of myself in the mirror. So naive, so trusting. A wry smile touched my lips. They'd never suspected the steel beneath the surface. They'd mistaken my kindness for weakness. Their mistake. A light knock on the door broke through my reverie. My stepmother. Perfect. Ava, darling, is everything all right? I heard you moving around. Her voice dripped with false concern. Just a bad dream, I replied, my voice carefully modulated to sound sleepy and a little scared. Just the right amount of vulnerability to put her at ease. She opened the door a crack, peering in. Oh, you poor thing. You know your grandfather always worried about you. He'd want you to get your rest. Her eyes flicked to the jewelry box on my dresser. Always the opportunist. I know, I said softly. I miss him so much. Of course, dear, we all do. Now, you try to get some sleep. And don't worry about a thing. Everything is going to be just fine. She gave me a brittle smile and closed the door gently. I leaned back against the pillows, a cold fury simmering beneath the surface. Everything is going to be just fine. Oh yes, everything was going to be perfectly fine, just not for them. 3 years, I thought. 3 years to prepare, 3 years to weave my web. They thought they'd won. They thought they'd gotten away with it. But they were wrong. This time, the ending would be very different. This time, justice wouldn't be about fighting them head on. It would be about letting them think they'd won, letting them bask in their ill-gotten gains, all while I quietly, meticulously orchestrated their downfall. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was back, but I wasn't the same. I was armed with knowledge, fueled by betrayal, and driven by a burning desire for, not revenge, exactly. More like a course correction, a rebalancing of the scales, and I had 3 years to make it happen. The first order of business was securing my financial future, no more relying on the whims of my loving family. I started small, siphoning off tiny amounts from my allowance, claiming I was saving up for a new dress or some other frivolous expense. They barely blinked. Perfect. Next, I opened accounts at different banks using variations of my middle name and my mother's maiden name. Identities they wouldn't readily connect to me. I even dug out an old library card and used that address for one, just to be safe. Every week, I deposited a little here, a little there, nothing that would raise any red flags. It was a slow process, but I had time. And patience was a virtue I'd learned the hard way. Then came the legal groundwork. I remembered a name from my past life, a lawyer known for his discretion and his flexibility. Mr. Sterling. I found his number and arranged a meeting, posing as a young woman with a small inheritance who wanted to protect her assets from people like my family. He didn't ask too many questions. He didn't need to. Trusts, shell corporations, offshore accounts. We can make it very difficult for anyone to trace your assets, Miss Sinclair, he'd said, his eyes gleaming with a hint of amusement. Just tell me what you need. Absolute secrecy, I'd emphasized, and ironclad protection. He'd chuckled. Consider it done. With my financial safety net in place, I turned my attention to my relatives. Uncle Richard, always eager to flaunt his business prowess, was easy to manipulate. I'd casually ask about the company, feigning interest in his latest ventures. Then I'd subtly plant seeds of doubt, questioning his decisions, expressing concerns about his strategies. But Uncle Richard, I'd say, my voice wide-eyed with innocence, wouldn't it be risky to invest so much in that new project? What if it fails? He'd scoff, puffing up his chest. Don't you worry your pretty little head about that, Ava. I know what I'm doing. Of course he didn't, and I knew exactly how his arrogance would lead to his downfall. My cousin Julian was even easier to predict. Spoiled and entitled, he saw the inheritance as an endless supply of cash to fuel his extravagant lifestyle. I'd watch him with a detached amusement, noting his gambling habits, his expensive tastes, his complete lack of financial sense. Every late-night poker game, every designer suit, every bottle of champagne, it was all being meticulously filed away for future use. One evening, I found Uncle Richard in the study, poring over some documents. What are those? I asked, peering over his shoulder. Just some business papers, he said dismissively. Nothing for you to worry about. Oh, but I am interested in the company, I insisted. Grandpa always said I should learn about it. He hesitated, then sighed. Fine, have a look. But don't ask me to explain everything. It's complicated. I scanned the papers, feigning confusion. But these numbers don't seem right. Are you sure this investment is a good idea? He waved a hand dismissively. Of course it is. I know what I'm doing. I bit back a smile. He had no idea, and that was exactly how I wanted it. The irony of it all was almost comical. They saw me as a silly, naive girl, easily manipulated and controlled. They thought they were the smart ones, the ones in charge. But they were blind to the truth. They were puppets dancing on my strings, and they didn't even know it. I was the architect of their downfall, and they were blissfully unaware, lost in their dreams of wealth and power. Oh, how the mighty would fall. Grandpa's health began its slow, inevitable decline. It was a painful process to watch, but I played my part perfectly, the picture of the devoted granddaughter. I spent hours at his bedside, reading to him, listening to his stories, holding his hand. My relatives, of course, saw this as nothing more than sentimental duty, further cementing their image of me as the sweet, harmless, easily manipulated Ava. They couldn't see the cold calculation behind my gentle smile, the strategic purpose in every tear I shed. Their greed, however, was becoming increasingly difficult to conceal. They hovered around Grandpa like vultures, their whispers echoing in the halls when they thought I couldn't hear. When will it happen? They'd mutter. How much do you think we'll get? Their impatience was palpable, a thick, toxic cloud hanging over the house. It was during one of these whispered conversations that I overheard something interesting. A mention of a hidden clause in Grandpa's will, a clause that apparently benefited me. My ears perked up. This was unexpected. I hadn't planned on this. But I'm nothing if not adaptable. Later that day, I stumbled upon the will myself, tucked away in Grandpa's old desk. I feigned surprise as I read the clause, my eyes widening with mock astonishment. Perfect. That evening, I sought out my stepmother, feigning distress. I I don't know what to do, I stammered, clutching the will in my hands. I found this hidden clause. It says, it says I inherit a significant portion of the estate. Her eyes narrowed, her smile vanishing. Let me see that, she said, snatching the document from my grasp. She read the clause, her face growing redder with each word. This is outrageous, she exclaimed. Your grandfather never intended this. I know, I said, my voice trembling. I don't want any trouble. I don't know what to do. She paced the room, her mind clearly racing. Don't worry, darling, she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. We'll take care of everything. Your grandfather wouldn't want you to be burdened with all this. Really? I asked, my eyes wide with feigned innocence. Of course, she said. We're family. We'll look after you. I gave her a grateful smile. Thank you, I said. I don't know what I'd do without you. She patted my hand condescendingly. Don't mention it, dear. Now, you just leave everything to us. Perfect, just as planned. She thought she was so clever, so cunning. She had no idea that she was playing right into my hands. A few days later, I had a casual conversation with Uncle Richard about the will. I'm a little worried about the future, I said, my voice laced with anxiety. Grandpa always took care of me. I don't know what I'll do without him. He chuckled. Don't worry, Ava, he said. We'll make sure you're taken care of. But what about the will? I asked. I heard there's a clause that benefits me. His smile faltered for a moment. Yes, well, he said, your grandfather was sentimental. He didn't always think things through. Oh, I said, feigning disappointment. I see. Don't worry, he repeated. We'll handle everything. You just focus on grieving. I nodded, my eyes downcast. Okay, I said softly. Thank you, Uncle Richard. He patted my shoulder. Anytime, Ava, we're family. I watched him walk away, a slow smile spreading across my face. They were so predictable, so blinded by their greed. They thought they were so clever, so in control. But they were wrong. They were walking right into my trap, and they didn't even suspect a thing. The irony was delicious. They thought they were taking advantage of me, but I was the one pulling the strings. And soon they would learn just how dangerous it was to underestimate Ava Sinclair. The air in the lawyer's office was thick with tension, a palpable buzz of anticipation and barely concealed greed. Grandpa was gone. The reading of the will was about to begin. My heart beat a steady rhythm, not of sadness, but of anticipation. The final act was about to commence. My relatives were all there, of course. Uncle Richard, his face flushed with barely contained excitement. Stepmother Carol, her eyes gleaming with avarice. Cousin Julian, looking bored and impatient, probably already planning how he was going to spend his inheritance. Mr. Henderson, the family lawyer, cleared his throat, a somber expression plastered on his face. He began to read the will, droning on about trusts and assets and beneficiaries. My relatives listened intently, their eyes glued to him, hanging on every word. And then, the bombshell. Mr. Henderson paused, his gaze shifting to my stepmother. I'm afraid there's been a development, he stammered. A new will has been presented. Carol stepped forward, a smug look on her face. Yes, she said smoothly. My dear grandfather decided to make some revisions. He felt it was best for the family if the bulk of the estate went to those who truly deserved it. She produced a document, a crisp, official-looking piece of paper. Mr. Henderson examined it, his eyebrows furrowed. This appears to be in order, he mumbled. My blood ran cold. The forged document. Just as planned. Mr. Henderson continued reading, outlining how the bulk of the estate, the company, the houses, the investments, would be divided amongst my uncle, my stepmother, and my cousin. My name was barely mentioned, a small, almost insulting sum left to me as a token of remembrance. I feigned shock, my breath catching in my throat. But, but Grandpa promised? I stammered, tears welling up in my eyes. He said he wanted me to be taken care of. Carol gave me a patronizing smile. Oh, darling, she said, her voice dripping with condescension. You know how old people are. They change their minds. Besides, Richard is much better equipped to manage the company. You wouldn't know what to do with it. Richard nodded in agreement. It's for the best, Ava, he said, patting my hand dismissively. Don't worry. We'll take care of you. I let the tears flow freely now, my face crumpling with feigned devastation. I just don't understand, I sobbed. Grandpa, he wouldn't. Julian rolled his eyes. Just get on with it, he muttered impatiently. I'm starving! Mr. Henderson finished reading the will, his expression carefully neutral. My relatives exchanged triumphant glances, their faces beaming with undisguised glee. They had won. They had taken everything. I looked at them, my eyes filled with tears, my face a mask of heartbreak. They saw weakness. They saw defeat. They had no idea that they were looking at the architect of their destruction. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on me. I had lost everything, yes, but in losing everything, I had gained everything. I was free. Free from their expectations, free from their control, free to enact my plan. They thought they had won, but they were wrong. So very wrong. This was just the beginning. The game was afoot. The beauty of being underestimated is that it makes disappearing incredibly easy. A few whispered rumors about a heartbroken girl seeking solace in a distant city, a tearful goodbye to the housekeeper, the only person in that house I genuinely cared about. And I was gone, vanished. They barely even noticed. Too busy dividing their spoils, I suppose. Uncle Richard, now the self-proclaimed king of the Sinclair Empire, immediately set about modernizing the company, which, in his limited understanding, meant gutting long-standing partnerships, investing in risky ventures, and generally throwing money around like a toddler with a fistful of glitter. I watched from afar, a ghost in the machine, occasionally feeding a disgruntled employee a juicy bit of gossip or accidentally leaking confidential information to a competitor. Just subtle nudges, enough to accelerate the inevitable. Carol, bless her materialistic heart, went on a spending spree of epic proportions. A sprawling mansion in the most exclusive part of town, a wardrobe overflowing with designer labels, enough diamonds to sink a yacht. She indulged in every vulgar extravagance imaginable. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But then I'd remember the smug look on her face as she'd declared, "This is what we deserve, Ava. This is what happens when you're on the winning side." And the pity would evaporate. Julian predictably doubled down on his vices. High-stakes poker games, lavish parties, a string of interchangeable girlfriends with expensive tastes. He burned through his inheritance like it was an inexhaustible resource. I'd get snippets of information from my network of informants. A whispered conversation in a casino, a drunken confession at a nightclub, a disgruntled ex-lover spilling the tea. Each tidbit was another nail in his coffin, another piece of the puzzle falling into place. While they were busy squandering their ill-gotten gains, I was playing the long game. The money I'd siphoned off, the shell corporations I'd established, the trust I'd created, they were all working in perfect harmony. I was quietly buying up shares of the company, my ownership hidden behind layers of legal obfuscation. Each acquisition brought me closer to my goal, each transaction a silent victory. The company's in freefall, Miss Sinclair, Mr. Sterling reported, a hint of amusement in his voice. Your uncle is desperate. He's looking for investors. Excellent, I replied, a slow smile spreading across my face. Let him sweat a little longer. And Mrs. Sinclair? Her finances are precarious, to say the least. She's leveraged herself to the hilt. Good, let the vultures start circling. And Mr. Julian? He's in deep with some rather unsavory characters. I wouldn't be surprised if he ended up... Don't worry about Julian, I interrupted. He'll get what's coming to him. I hung up the phone, a sense of satisfaction washing over me. They were dancing on the edge of a precipice, oblivious to the abyss below. They thought they were invincible, untouchable. They had no idea that their world was about to crumble. And I, the ghost they'd dismissed, the girl they'd betrayed, would be there to witness their downfall. It wouldn't be long now. The seeds of destruction had been sown, and the harvest was about to begin. The cracks in Uncle Richard's facade began to show with alarming speed. The risky ventures he'd poured money into turned sour, one after another. Long-standing clients, alienated by his abrasive manner and questionable business practices, started taking their business elsewhere. The company's stock price plummeted, and the whispers started. Whispers of mismanagement, of impending bankruptcy, of a sinking ship. Key executives, sensing the impending doom, jumped ship, taking their expertise and valuable connections with them. Investors, once eager to throw money at Richard's vision, now scrambled to withdraw their funds, fearing they'd be left holding the bag when the inevitable crash came. The once thriving Sinclair empire was hemorrhaging money, its foundations crumbling beneath the weight of Richard's incompetence. I, of course, was far from idle. Through my network of shell corporations and carefully cultivated contacts, I exerted subtle pressure, accelerating the company's decline. A well-placed rumor here, a strategically timed leak there, a few anonymous calls to the right authorities. It was all part of the symphony of destruction I was conducting, and Richard, blinded by his arrogance and desperation, remained blissfully unaware of the puppet master pulling the strings. His paranoia grew with each passing day. He saw enemies lurking around every corner, conspiracies brewing in every shadow. He lashed out at his remaining allies, accusing them of disloyalty, of sabotage. He alienated his business partners, his friends, even his own family. He was a cornered animal, thrashing wildly, digging himself deeper into the hole he'd created. "You're bleeding us dry, Richard," his business partner, Mr. Evans, roared during a particularly heated board meeting. "Your reckless decisions have cost us millions. We need to cut our losses and salvage what we can. Don't you dare question my judgment," Richard thundered, his face contorted with rage. "I built this company. I know what I'm doing." "No, you don't," Mr. Evans retorted. "You're destroying everything your father worked for. Step down, Richard, before it's too late." "Never," Richard spat. "I won't let you vultures take what's rightfully mine." The meeting devolved into a shouting match, accusations flying like daggers. Richard stormed out, leaving behind a room full of disillusioned and angry investors. The writing was on the wall. The Sinclair empire was collapsing, and Richard, the architect of its downfall, was too blind to see it. I watched it all unfold from a distance, a sense of detached satisfaction filling me. My plan was working perfectly. Richard was imploding, his empire crumbling around him. Soon he would be left with nothing but the ashes of his own ambition, and I, the girl he'd dismissed, the niece he'd betrayed, would be there to witness his downfall. It was a delicious irony, a fitting punishment for his greed and arrogance. The game was nearing its end, and I was ready to claim my victory. Carol's world, built on a foundation of stolen money and bad taste, began to crumble with a speed that was almost comical. The endless stream of designer clothes, the lavish parties, the impulsive purchases of investment properties, which were really just excuses for more extravagant vacations, it all caught up with her. Her bank accounts, once overflowing with ill-gotten gains, dwindled alarmingly. The calls from creditors started, first a trickle, then a torrent. "Mrs. Sinclair, we haven't received your payment for the last 3 months," a stern voice would say on the other end of the line. "We need you to settle your account immediately." "Oh, there must be some mistake," Carol would reply, her voice fluttering with faint concern. "I'll have my accountant look into it right away." But the calls kept coming, each one more insistent than the last. The bills piled up, unpaid. The threats escalated. The first to go were the frivolous luxuries, the spa treatments, the personal shopper, the weekly deliveries of exotic flowers. Then came the more substantial cuts. The staff at the mansion were let go, the expensive cars were sold off, the designer wardrobe was quietly consigned. Desperate to maintain her lifestyle, Carol resorted to increasingly risky investments, pouring money into schemes that promised quick returns but delivered only losses. She chased every get-rich-quick fad, every dubious opportunity, every whispered tip from her socialite friends. Each failure dug her deeper into the hole, the walls of her gilded cage closing in. "Darling, I need your help," she'd sobbed to Richard. her voice thick with panic. I'm in trouble. They're threatening to take everything. What have you done? He'd snap, his own anxieties bubbling to the surface. I told you to be careful with the money. And I was just trying to invest it wisely, she'd wail. But everything went wrong. Please, Richard, you have to help me. He'd sigh, his shoulders slumping under the weight of his own problems. I don't know what to do, Carol. The company's not doing well. I can't afford to bail you out. But, but what about me? She'd cry. What am I going to do? He'd turn away, his face etched with frustration and despair. I don't know, he'd mutter. Just try to fix it. I watched her unraveling from afar, a detached observer to her slow-motion train wreck. The irony was delicious. She'd spent years dreaming of wealth and luxury, only to find herself drowning in debt and desperation. She'd thought she'd outsmarted me, but in reality she'd been her own worst enemy. Her greed, her vanity, her insatiable desire for more. It had all led her to this. She'd built her life on a foundation of sand, and now the tide was coming in, washing away her illusions, exposing the emptiness beneath. She'd thought she was living the dream, but she was living a lie, a carefully constructed facade that was crumbling before her eyes. And I, the girl she'd dismissed, the stepdaughter she'd betrayed, was watching it all unfold with a sense of quiet satisfaction. The game was almost over, and Carol, the queen of extravagance, was about to learn a harsh lesson about the fleeting nature of ill-gotten gains. Julian, the spoiled prince of the Sinclair clan, never had much use for restraint. Money, in his mind, was an endless resource, a magical well that would always replenish itself. His inheritance, a hefty chunk of Grandpa's fortune, fueled his extravagant lifestyle. The designer clothes, the luxury cars, the endless parties, and of course, his insatiable gambling habit. He flitted from one high-stakes poker game to the next, convinced that his luck would never run out. He was wrong. The losses started small, easily dismissed as minor setbacks. But the stakes kept getting higher, the bets more reckless, the losses more substantial. Soon he was in deep, owing vast sums of money to people who didn't take kindly to unpaid debts. The friendly pats on the back and invitations to exclusive gatherings vanished, replaced by threatening phone calls and ominous visits from burly men with thick necks and cold eyes. Julian, we need to talk about your outstanding balance, a gravelly voice would growl on the other end of the line. It's been too long. Oh, come on, Tony, Julian would reply, his voice strained with forced nonchalance. You know I'm good for it. Just give me a little more time. Time's up, kid, the voice would snap. You got till the end of the week. Pay up or... The threats were left unspoken, but the implication was clear. Julian's carefree world was shrinking, the walls closing in. Desperate, he turned to his family, his pleas for help growing increasingly frantic. Richard, I need your help, he'd plead, his voice trembling with panic. I'm in trouble. I owe a lot of money to some bad people. What have you done? Richard would thunder, his own anxieties amplified by Julian's predicament. I told you to be careful with that money. I got unlucky, Julian would stammer. Please, Richard, you have to help me. They'll hurt me if I don't pay them back. But Richard, his own empire crumbling around him, had nothing left to give. Carol, drowning in her own sea of debt, was equally unhelpful. Julian's pleas fell on deaf ears, his cries for help echoing in the empty halls of their crumbling mansion. Driven to desperation, Julian resorted to increasingly reckless measures. He pawned his remaining valuables, borrowed money from anyone who would lend it to him, even dabbled in illegal activities, hoping to score a big win that would solve all his problems. But luck, it seemed, had abandoned him. Each gamble failed. Each scheme backfired. Each desperate attempt to escape the hole he dug only pushed him deeper into the abyss. I watched his descent with a strange mix of pity and detachment. Julian, with all his flaws, wasn't inherently evil. He was just weak, spoiled, and easily led astray. He'd had the potential to be something more, to do something meaningful with his life. But he'd squandered it all, chasing fleeting pleasures and empty thrills. Now he was paying the price for his recklessness, his life spiraling out of control. His downfall was a tragedy, yes, but it was also a consequence of his own choices. He'd made his bed, and now he had to lie in it. And I, the cousin he'd dismissed, the family member he'd betrayed, would be there to witness the final act of his self-inflicted destruction. The game was nearing its climax, and Julian, the prodigal son, was about to face the consequences of his actions. The wheels of justice, once set in motion, turned with a relentless, unstoppable momentum. For Uncle Richard, the downfall was swift and brutal. The authorities, alerted to his shady dealings by a series of anonymous tips, orchestrated by yours truly, of course, launched a full-scale investigation. Financial records were scrutinized, shady deals were exposed, and a long list of fraudulent activities came to light. The arrest was a public spectacle, a media frenzy of flashing cameras and breathless reporters. Mr. Sinclair, how do you explain these discrepancies in your company's finances? A reporter shouted, shoving a microphone in his face. No comment, Richard snarled, his face contorted with rage and fear. This is all a misunderstanding. I'm innocent. But his protests fell on deaf ears. The evidence was overwhelming. The charges undeniable. He was stripped of his position, his assets frozen, his reputation shattered. The man who once strutted through the world with an air of arrogant invincibility was now a prisoner in his own gilded cage, facing the prospect of a long and humiliating trial. Carol's fate was equally grim, though less dramatic. The creditors, tired of her empty promises and delayed payments, finally pounced. Lawsuits piled up, each one chipping away at her remaining assets. The mansion, once a symbol of her extravagant lifestyle, was seized and sold off to the highest bidder. Her designer wardrobe, her jewelry collection, her precious investment properties. All vanished, swallowed by the insatiable maw of debt. She was left with nothing but a suitcase full of clothes and a mountain of regret. This can't be happening, she wailed, her voice hoarse with despair. I've lost everything. What am I going to do? But there were no answers, no comforting words, no helping hands. She'd burned her bridges, alienated her friends, and squandered her fortune. Now she was paying the price, alone and abandoned. Julian's downfall was the most tragic, perhaps. His debts, spiraling out of control, had led him into dangerous territory. Desperate for a way out, he'd crossed the line, involving himself in illegal activities that quickly caught the attention of the authorities. The arrest was swift and brutal, the charges serious. He faced the prospect of a long prison sentence, his life irrevocably altered by his own reckless choices. Julian, you have the right to remain silent, the officer intoned, his voice flat and emotionless. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. Julian, his eyes wide with fear and regret, could only nod dumbly. His dreams of wealth and freedom shattered against the harsh reality of his situation. I watched their downfall from afar, a silent observer to their self-inflicted destruction. They had thought they were above the law, untouchable, invincible. But they were wrong. The law, like karma, had a way of catching up, of balancing the scales. They had played a dangerous game, and now they were paying the price. Their downfall wasn't a source of joy for me, not exactly. There was a sense of satisfaction, yes, a feeling of justice being served, but there was also a tinge of sadness, a recognition of the wasted potential, the squandered opportunities, the lives irrevocably damaged by their own greed and arrogance. They had been given a chance, a gift, and they had thrown it all away. And now they were facing the consequences, alone and abandoned, the echoes of their laughter replaced by the cold, hard clang of prison doors. The whispers started subtly, like a breeze rustling through the leaves. Then they grew louder, gaining momentum, swirling into a storm of speculation and intrigue. Who was the mysterious figure buying up Sinclair stock? Who was the silent benefactor pulling the strings behind the scenes? The media, always hungry for a juicy story, dug deeper, sniffing out clues, piecing together the puzzle. And then the truth emerged. Explosive and undeniable. Ava Sinclair, the forgotten granddaughter, the presumed victim, was the mastermind behind it all. The girl they had dismissed, the heiress they had cheated, had played them all for fools. The newspapers splashed my name across their front pages, the headlines screaming, "The Sinclair heiress strikes back." From Victim to Victor, Ava Sinclair's Revenge. The Fall of the Sinclair Empire, a masterclass in manipulation. My phone rang incessantly, the screen flashing with calls from reporters, lawyers, and even a few opportunistic investors hoping to get a piece of the action. I ignored them all. This was my story, my victory, and I wasn't about to share the spotlight with anyone. My relatives, meanwhile, were reeling from the shock. Their smug smiles vanished, replaced by expressions of disbelief, anger, and humiliation. They had been outsmarted, outmaneuvered, and utterly defeated by the girl they had underestimated. The realization was a bitter pill to swallow, a crushing blow to their egos. That conniving, Richard sputtered, his face contorted with rage. She played us all. She took everything. I can't believe it, Carol wailed, her voice thick with despair. She ruined us. She took our home, our money, our everything. We have to do something, Julian pleaded, his eyes wide with panic. We have to stop her. But there was nothing they could do. They were trapped, their backs against the wall, their options exhausted. They had played a dangerous game, and they had lost. Now they were facing the consequences, their lives in ruins, their futures uncertain. Desperate, they reached out to me, their pride swallowed by their desperation. The phone calls came, one after another, each one more pathetic than the last. Ava, please, you have to help us, Richard begged, his voice cracking with desperation. We're family. We made a mistake. Please forgive us. Ava, darling, it's Carol. A tearful voice sobbed on the other end of the line. I'm so sorry for everything. Please just give us another chance. We'll do anything. Ava, it's Julian, a shaky voice pleaded. I know I messed up, but please don't let them send me to prison. I'll change. I promise. I listened to their pleas, their apologies, their desperate attempts to salvage what was left of their lives. And I felt nothing. No anger, no hatred, no desire for revenge. Just a quiet sense of satisfaction, a cold, hard certainty that justice had been served. I didn't answer their calls. I didn't respond to their messages. I simply deleted them, erasing their voices from my life, their pleas for mercy fading into the digital void. They had made their choices, and now they had to live with the consequences. The game was over, and I had won. The Sinclair legacy was mine, and I would use it to build a new empire, one founded on integrity, compassion, and a deep understanding of the consequences of greed and betrayal.